Hello and welcome to Bloomberg TV India's special series in the run-up to Budget 2015, Ideas for Transforming India. I'm Siddharth Zarabi. This show focuses on the big picture plan that can fundamentally transform the trajectory of India's economy and the fortunes of its 1.2 billion people. Half of India's workforce depends on agriculture, but the sector currently accounts for only 1/6 of India's economy. India produces more food than it can store, but many still go hungry. So what's getting lost between the farm and the folk? Joining me to talk about the radical changes needed in India's farm sector, noted economist Ashok Desai, H R Dave, Deputy Managing Director at NABARD, and R. Ramakumar of the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us on this show where we discuss and try and get ideas for radical transformation. That's the tone and tenor of the show. And let me come to you, Mr. Desai, first, in terms of that one big idea that you think needs to be talked about and implemented to get this gap between the farm and the folk sorted out. Mr. Desai, over to you first.
What we really need to do is to remove all the controls on agriculture and let it compete internationally. We are producing far too much of food grains because food grain prices are supported and pushed up, and the government keeps buying the food grains and just storing them to rot there. We must change this policy. We must buy only as much of food grains as the government has immediate need for, and for the rest we should free up the agricultural markets so that farmers can get away from producing more and more food grains and start producing internationally competitive crops.
Okay, Mr. Desai, those are fundamentally good suggestions. The big ticket idea really that you are saying is reduce controls and get the government out of its politically convenient habit of the MSP, which is basically in some ways a tool to influence farm votes, if I may put it that way. Coming to you second, Mr. Dave, for your first and major suggestion as far as this issue is concerned.
I will take from where Mr. Desai left. You see, the states which have registered 10% kind of agricultural growth rate, it has not come through food grains. It has come through diversification of agriculture. Therefore, what is important is how do we diversify agriculture, and for that what is required is capital formation in agriculture, both public as well as private. Now, public investment happens through government interventions, whereas the private capital formation happens through mostly, I would say 80% of private capital formation in Indian agriculture today happens through bank loans. So what is required is a mechanism where capital formation both in public and private sector is encouraged, and therefore I believe while government looks at the rural infrastructure in general, the Indian banking system must gear up to finance the agricultural
Mr. Dave,
term
the
loans
point that
on a
you
scale
make
which
is
has
well
never been
noted.
done
You're
by
talking
them.
about the need to enhance capital formation in this sector and therefore provide a viable long-term financial model to attract investments into this sector, and that's a logical extension of the point that Mr. Desai made. Let me go across to Mr. Ramakumar for his opening suggestion on this show. Mr. Ramakumar, what's the big ticket idea that you would like to propose at this stage?
For me, it's not a big ticket idea. I think the most important objective of this budget has to be to make small peasant farming in India an economic proposition, which is currently hugely uneconomic. The most recent data released by the Government of India would show for the year 2012-13, the average monthly income of an agricultural household in India is something less than rupees 6,500. So how to make small peasant farming in India economic? And by making it economic, how do you reduce the tendency that you see widespread regarding farmer suicides and so on? That That'll be the way I would enter into the debate. Regarding the big ticket idea that Professor Desai mentioned a little while back, I think what we should remember is that that is a debate that was settled in 2012 and 13 when India passed the Food Security Act. Even though it doesn't make food security universal, it did bring in an enormous share of our rural and urban household into the net of our food security system. That has not been implemented. The Shantakumar committee actually has recommended a cutting of the share of households to be covered under the Act to 40% or so, which is actually going against the spirit of the Food Security Act. You cannot cut back on the Food Security Act and then complain that food grains are rotting in the godowns and people are still going hungry.
Right.
That's a completely contradictory argument.
Right. Mr. Ramakumar, your points are well taken, and you talk about small farms, which is actually one of the key differentiators when it comes to land holdings and the nature of the farming sector in India. Coming back to you, Mr. Desai, you heard the point about food security, and if that was the big ticket idea at that stage with regard to taking care of a variety of objectives, including eliminating hunger, reducing poverty, better distribution of what you have in your food stocks, that was then. And the current government has been toying with the idea of restructuring this Food Security Act, even as its full-scale implementation is still awaited. On that point, do you think it is time for a Food Security version 2.0? Is that one of the ideas that should be toyed at at this stage?
I think we should forget food security. Food security is not necessary. If the government stopped buying food grains, the prices of food grains would be much, much lower, and the poorer people would be able to feed themselves much better. The government does not have to look after their needs in the way it is doing, which is by just buying up food grains and pushing up their prices and making all of us poorer.
Okay, Mr. Desai, that's very well put. And before I go across to Mr. Dave, I'm going to get Mr. Ramakumar to comment on this proposition that Mr. Desai has put forward. The point being that because the government has such a heavy-handed intervention in procurement and the prices that it sets through the MSP formula, you are actually making it difficult for people to buy food out there in the market because you are basically raising the benchmark so high. He says, Mr. Desai says that we don't need the food security law at all, and that's an idea that he believes in. What do you have to say to that, Ramakumar?
I certainly do not believe in that idea. I believe the Food Security Act has a great role to play in addressing the questions of food security in India. Regarding the point Professor Desai made, let me just remind him that the most recent survey, again, I am again repeating the results of that survey, only about 12 to 15% of the paddy and wheat farmers in India are in any way connected to the procurement system. The remaining 85% of the paddy and wheat farmers in India have nothing to do with procurement. They sell to the open market or they consume for themselves. So in terms of the number of farm households that we are talking about only 12 to 15% of the households if we are talking about procurement. Secondly, the idea of procurement has to be seen linked to a national food policy. You have great unevenness in food grain production in India, and it has again and again been shown that the market is an inefficient mover of food grains from the surplus areas to the deficit areas. Hence, you need the state as a facilitator in terms of procuring and distributing food grains. That role cannot simply be given away to the market. Experience has shown that again and again. So I would see a great role that persists for the Food Security Act. I think its scope needs to be expanded to bring in more food types of food grains into its ambit. There are questions related to its exclusion, the number of people it excludes even after covering so many people in the rural areas. Those are the things that you need to deal with rather than go back to this stale debate of whether you need Food Security Act or not. That's why I mentioned that's something that the Parliament had settled in 2012 and 13.
Okay, two dramatically different propositions at two extreme ends of the spectrum. The point really being is is the idea that the Food Security Act in its current form and shape one that beggars us all, versus the proposition that has been made by Ramakumar, saying that you in fact need an expansion of it in coverage terms, both in terms of the population that is covered and also the food products that are covered. Mr. Dave, you know, before I ask you for an idea, would you want to comment about these two separate propositions?
Dependency on the core cereals which used to be there, it is no more there. There is a huge focus on value addition in agriculture. Processed food is in higher demand. So the consumption of agricultural commodities in the processed form has made the canvas altogether different. So while on one spectrum of the population we talk of making to ensure that the food grains are available, on the other spectrum of the same demand system, we must realize that the consumption patterns have completely changed.
Okay, and therefore if consumption patterns have completely changed, what would you therefore advance as the second idea from your side in this debate?
So we need to, well, I'll go back to what Mr. Ramkumar said, viability of agriculture. Let me first look at the demand side. You see, if agriculture is not viable, primarily because the land holdings have become so small that it is not an economic unit. The answer lies therefore in aggregation at input level as well as output level. So that is one of the big thing which country will have to look at it. You have 600,000 villages in India and you hardly have 1,000 producers collectives. Now if that be the scenario, how are we going to look at the entire option of aggregation of inputs for agriculture and outputs for agriculture? And therefore I look forward to some stronger action on facilitating aggregation of the farmers. They must come together either for cultivation purposes, for procurement of inputs, or for linking them to markets. Unless they come together, they will not be able to negotiate better prices. I must add at the same time that the entire spectrum of warehousing and cold storages, both dry and cold storages,
right,
that is also another important thing which we'll have to drive. The cold storage sector has been complaining of viability, and viability somewhere, either it is not turning out to be viable because of the high power cost or other fiscal incentives which the entire cold storage industry possibly needs. I think these are the areas where I hope that some solutions will be found in the next budget.
Okay, some of the solutions that you expect to be found in the next budget, and that's your hope. Well, it's time for a break on Ideas for Transforming India. Ashok Desai, HR Dave and R. Ramakumar all stay with us. Welcome back to Ideas for Transforming India. We're discussing the big ideas required to radically transform India's agriculture sector. Still with me, Ashok Desai, HR Dave and R. Ramakumar. Mr. Desai, before I come to you for your third idea in this debate, one of the major points that this government has announced, and correct me if I'm wrong, the only big ticket item, so to say, that we have heard that comes easily to recall is a separate channel for the farm sector, a Krishi channel, so to say. It's not yet taken off. It should have taken off. One wonders what is happening on that front. But that's just as far as information and awareness is concerned. But in terms of the ideation that you would have expected from this government with the kind of mandate that it had, and especially given the nature of its mandate, do you at all feel that it is in a stage to consider any of the ideas that all of you are putting forth, apart from what you want to suggest at the third point? Mr. Desai.
This is not just true of ideas on agriculture, but it is true of all ideas. This government came to power quite suddenly. It was quite unprepared for power, and it has never thought about what it would do when it would get into power. And this is just as much as true of its agricultural policy as of its industrial policy and trade policy, fiscal policy, and so on. They are still learning the business.
Okay, they're still learning the ropes, but Mr. Desai, once again, to now put an idea before you and ask you for a comment, you know, if one way to describe it, the UPA's policies, at least on paper, and the communication around the farm sector was that they spoke a great deal about decentralization. This government's approach has largely been to centralize things from a top-down perspective. Do you have anything to suggest as far as managing the agriculture beat, so to say, on behalf of the central government is concerned? Because there is ultimately a huge amount of money that is earmarked every year for the farm sector.
Well, that money mostly comes from the central government, even though quite a lot of it is spent by the state governments. The state governments are given the money to implement projects, but it's the central government which generates the money. And it's the central government that has always generated ideas. So the thinking on this question, as on others, must start in Delhi. It is necessary to involve the states, as the Prime Minister has done in Niti Aayog. Niti Aayog has really now become a cooperative of the center and the states, and this should be possible with all types of thinking. But it is necessary that the lead should be taken from Delhi, and it should be taken and it should involve, let's say, people whom I would call intellectuals, people who don't have a stake, who don't have any vested interest one way or the other, but who think about the country as a whole.
Okay, you basically saying that as far as Delhi is concerned, it continues and should continue to drive this subject. Coming to you, Mr. Dave, one of our findings in this series earlier was that almost half of agriculture credit in the two states of Maharashtra around 45%, West Bengal around 55%, goes to urban areas, and it also goes in what are the non-farming, non-agriculture months. That was a finding that surprised us. In terms of agriculture lending, so to say, you did touch upon this subject, but why is this happening, and is there a newer approach that is required on this front? Because clearly this is a puzzle.
Well, I would say that first of all, to say that a lot of agriculture credit is flowing in urban and metro areas, I think there are certain statistical errors, there are certain reporting issues. Many banks which are headquartered in Mumbai, for instance, they report their disbursements data, outstanding data as Mumbai, whereas actually the money has gone into Vidarbha and Marathwada. So I really don't accept that money is going in urban areas or metros, which is meant for agriculture. The second point is that you see, we'll have to give full credit to this government, because in the very first budget, for instance, they created a fund in NABARD for facilitating investment credit in rural areas. So there was a long-term rural credit fund created in NABARD, which was first time ever, and that money has been fully utilized. I mean, the kind of demand that I have for, even if I take 5 major agriculture sectors, irrigation, farm mechanization, agro processing, horticulture, and one more. So if 5 sectors alone would need about 15 lakh crore of investments in next 5 years, that is the broad estimate that we just worked out. These investments will have to come through the banking system. So as one of the ideas, possibly one can look at, Government of India suggesting some kind of sub-target within the agricultural credit target for extending term loans to farmers, number one, and number two, coming back to the point that you made about the quality of credit which is flowing, I would say time has possibly come where banks move away from the financial targets of, Union Budget announces every year 7 lakh crore, then 8 lakh crore and kind of thing. I think we need to look at the number of farmers to be added to the banking system on an annual basis. The reason being, the NSSO data, survey data which came out recently, they are not talking great things about the banking system in terms of its outreach. Large number of families, the agricultural families, still being outside the purview of the formal credit system. Many of them continue to be dependent on informal sources. So with entire gamut of rural branch opening,
Right.
the regional rural banks, the strengthening of cooperatives, a lot of efforts have gone to it. But I think now time has come to leverage the BCs, the business correspondents under the Janadhana Yojana, to make sure that agricultural credit also is transacted at the village level through BCs.
Okay, so a fundamentally different approach to lending, rather than lending aimed at just a number on a balance sheet at the end of the year. Look at it in quantitative terms of the number of farmers that are touched through this kind of targeted schemes, and also expanding the availability of the formal banking system in rural areas. That's a good point that you have made, Mr. Dave. Mr. Ramakumar, last 30 seconds of the show, and I'm going to ask you to tell us, what do you think is that one thing that should not be done by a government at this stage, even as it tries to ramp up and reduce the difference between the farm and the folk that this country faces several problems on account of? Mr. Ramakumar.
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer, but let me put it this way. I think what the government should do is to allow itself adequate fiscal space to intervene in the agricultural sector. The absence of a fiscal space, the fear of fiscal deficit, should not stand in the way of the government deciding to decisively intervene in the agricultural sector. If you ask me one thing that the government should not do, it is to disallow itself the fiscal space to intervene in the agricultural sector. This is particularly important because there is a big drought that is staring at us in the coming summer. You need a drought-proofing plan. You need significant investment to go into agricultural extension. You need to rejuvenate NREGS significantly to provide employment to the people in the rural areas, particularly in the dryland areas. This requires money. NREGS, PDS, drought proofing, all this requires money, and this the fear of fiscal deficit, let me say, should not disallow the government the fiscal space to shy away from intervening in this colossal crisis that is staring at us this summer.
Okay, don't allow the fiscal deficit to come in the way of taking care of the farm sector and the farmers, who are a substantial section of India's population and constitute the core of the Indian way of life, so to say. Thank you very much, Mr. Desai, Mr. Dave and Mr. Ramakumar, for all your suggestions on this subject. It's clear that this sector is crucial to India's economy, and every year the challenges persist. One year it might be floods, the second year it might be a drought. That's the nature of India, and that's why the role of the center and directed policy in transforming this sector is extremely crucial. That's all the time we have for right now on this subject. We shall keep focusing on each key area of the economy that needs radical change to make the 21st century India's very own. Keep watching this space through the month. For right now, if you've been, thank you for watching.